There are nights so grim in America's past that entire counties pretend they never happened. Nights so suffocating that the generations born afterward still shudder when the date is spoken aloud. May 23, 1852, became one such night in the cotton parishes of central Alabama, a night when the Yansy plantation fell into a silence, drenched in blood. 17 bodies lay scattered across the grounds before sunrise, and the magistrate assigned to document the incident sealed his findings for 73 long years. When those papers were finally unsealed in 1925, 3 historians begged to have them locked away again, claiming the truth inside was too corrosive for public memory. What made this catastrophe different wasn't simply the death toll, but the shocking suggestion, supported by testimonies, letters, and quiet confessions, that everything began with 2 sisters who should have been mirror images, yet found themselves battling for the affection of the same man. A man they did not merely desire, but owned under the law of the antebellum South. Before we descend into this forgotten horror, I need you to do something for me. If stories like these, the ones buried, denied, and erased, fascinate you, hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know how far these suppressed pieces of American history travel today. Because to understand what happened that night, we need to step inside the world the Yancey twins inherited, a world wrapped in wealth, cruelty, and contradictions so deep they still echo through Alabama soil. Their plantation stretched across thousands of fertile acres along the Alabama River, its columned mansion standing like a monument to Southern ambition, with a veranda that wrapped around the house and French windows imported at extravagant cost. This estate, built by 4 generations of Yancey men, thrived on the labor of 143 enslaved people who planted, picked, cooked, cleaned, and suffered silently beneath the weight of someone else's dream. When Cornelius Yancey succumbed to cholera in 1848, he left behind an inheritance that society whispered about for months. His wife had died bringing their daughters into the world, leaving his entire legacy in the hands of those daughters, Caroline and Catherine, identical twins who shared the same face but little else. At 23, they stood taller than most women of their time, with dark auburn hair braided in elaborate coils, pale skin shielded by parasols, and green eyes sharp enough to unsettle anyone who met their gaze. Yet beneath that symmetry beat 2 divergent souls. Caroline possessed her father's rigidity, his calculation, his obsession with order. She managed the ledgers, negotiated cotton shipments, and cultivated the spotless reputation expected of a planter's daughter. Catherine, on the other hand, ignited gossip with every breath, riding horses alone, reading scandalous French novels, questioning the rules everyone else followed, and wandering the riverbanks like a spirit untethered to her society. They were identical in appearance, but their hearts moved in opposite directions. For 4 years, their uneasy balance held. Caroline ran the business, Catherine tended to the household, and the plantation kept producing its expected mountain of cotton bales each season. The enslaved workforce labored under the watchful cruelty of Virgil Henley, a Georgia-born overseer who believed fear was the only language worth speaking. But in March of 1852, a crack formed in the perfect facade of the Yancey estate. It began when Caroline traveled to the Montgomery slave market and paid an unusually high price for a man named Samuel, a tall, well-spoken, literate enslaved worker originally from Virginia. She intended him for household management, a rare intellectual asset she couldn't resist acquiring. What she didn't realize, what no one realized, was that Catherine had seen him first. She noticed the defiance in his posture, the intelligence simmering behind his eyes, the quiet dignity he maintained even while being auctioned like livestock. And in that unnoticed moment, the match that would burn the entire plantation to ash was struck. Samuel arrived at the Yancey plantation on March 18th, unaware that his presence would unravel every fragile thread holding the estate together. Caroline immediately placed him in the main house, overruling Henley's demand to send him to the fields where strong men were expected to toil until their bodies broke. She valued his literacy, his precision, the calm discipline he brought to every task, copying correspondence, organizing shipping records, and managing inventories with a meticulousness that impressed even her rigid standards. He spoke little, kept his gaze lowered, and moved with the cautious restraint of someone who had learned long ago that intelligence could be both an asset and a death sentence. For Caroline, he became an indispensable assistant. For Catherine, who watched him from windows, doorways, and shaded corners, he became something far more dangerous, the first person who made her question the boundaries she had been raised to believe were unbreakable. Their first real conversation happened on April 2nd in the quiet of the library, where dust settled over leather-bound volumes and sunlight cut through the room in pale strips. Samuel was cataloguing books when Catherine entered and deliberately shut the door behind her, a reckless gesture that would have scandalized the entire county had anyone seen it. She asked him whether he could truly read or merely copy titles, and after a moment of hesitation, a moment in which he weighed survival against honesty, he told her the truth. A Quaker woman in Virginia had taught him in secret, believing education was a universal right rather than a privilege reserved for the free. Catherine pulled a novel from the shelves, curious, and Samuel began describing its story, speaking with a depth and thoughtfulness that made Catherine sit, listen, and for the first time feel as though someone saw her mind rather than her pedigree. From that day forward, she sought him out again and again, each visit a step deeper into forbidden territory. Their meetings evolved into long, dangerous conversations about literature, freedom, music, morality, and the world beyond the Alabama River, the kind of discussions Catherine had never been allowed or encouraged to have. Samuel spoke carefully, always aware that a single misinterpreted word could cost him his life, yet he found himself drawn to her curiosity, her questions, her hunger for something beyond her sheltered existence. Catherine, raised among rules she despised but could never fully escape, felt a new world unfolding in front of her, one where rank and race briefly faded beneath the weight of genuine connection. What she saw in Samuel wasn't property, or duty, or a tool, as Caroline viewed him, but a man with thoughts sharp enough to slice through every illusion she'd ever carried. What Samuel saw in Catherine was far more complicated. She was both danger and solace, a woman capable of tenderness, yet bound by a system that made equality impossible. Their relationship wasn't yet physical, but it was already intimate in ways that carried the scent of catastrophe. Caroline noticed the changes before either of them realized how exposed they had become. She saw Catherine lingering where she didn't belong, offering excuses to be in rooms Samuel worked in, smiling in ways she hadn't smiled since their father died. And Caroline, who prided herself on detecting patterns, quickly sensed something slipping beyond her control. The final confirmation came when she found traces of a secret meeting spot in the hayloft, an unfolded blanket, a misplaced book, a warmth in the air that didn't belong to idle farmhands. It didn't take long for her to piece the puzzle together, and when she did, jealousy and fury intertwined inside her like twin serpents. But beneath the anger lurked something she refused to acknowledge, even to herself, the faint sting of envy toward her own sister, the awareness that she too had begun noticing Samuel, admiring him, feeling drawn toward the strength and intelligence he carried despite his chains. And with that realization, a rivalry that had simmered since childhood ignited into something far more volatile. The weeks that followed turned the Yansy plantation into a silent battleground where every glance, every quiet footstep, every missing minute of Samuel's time carried hidden meaning. Caroline, driven by equal parts fear and wounded pride, began summoning Samuel to the office late at night under the guise of bookkeeping, though her intentions shifted with each passing evening. She stood too close when reviewing ledgers, lingered too long over trivial questions, and spoke in tones that carried a softness utterly foreign to her usual crisp authority. Samuel sensed the shift immediately, recognizing the peril in Caroline's newfound interest, because unlike Catherine, who approached him with naive affection, Caroline held power sharp enough to carve his world apart in a single command. He tried withdrawing, tried shrinking back into invisibility, but Caroline insisted on keeping him near, sealing his fate in a web of obligation from which he could not untangle himself. Catherine noticed the change with growing dread. The gentle warmth in Samuel's presence when they met in secret began to feel clouded by exhaustion, by hesitation, by something heavier he couldn't hide. She confronted him on May 15th in the garden house, her words trembling with accusation, asking if Caroline had touched him, pressured him, claimed pieces of him in the name of ownership rather than affection. Samuel didn't answer, and his silence struck Catherine sharper than any confession. She insisted that she alone loved him, that Caroline was using him as a tool, that she would risk everything to free him. But Samuel, worn down by fear and impossible choices, reminded her that their consequences would never be equal. She risked scandal, exile. He risked torture, mutilation, and death. The truth hung between them like smoke, impossible to breathe yet refusing to dissipate. That same night, Catherine stormed into Caroline's bedroom and confronted her sister directly, unleashing years of rivalry in a single fevered argument. Their voices, overheard by Rose outside the door, cut through the hallway with accusations about ownership, desire, manipulation, and the unbearable truth that both women wanted what neither had the right to claim. Catherine accused Caroline of using Samuel as a pawn, while Caroline accused Catherine of childish fantasies that could get them both killed. The argument spiraled until Catherine made a reckless declaration. She would free Samuel legally, draw up manumission papers herself, and marry him in a northern state where their union might be recognized. Caroline's reaction was swift and ice-cold. She reminded Catherine that they each owned half of Samuel, that no legal freedom could be granted without both sisters' consent, and that if Catherine defied her, she had the right and the power to sell Samuel to the Deep South, where sugar plantations consumed men in months. The next morning, Caroline decided to sever the entire situation by force. When Samuel was found sitting silently in the old gin house, unresponsive, she confronted him with the decisive tone of a woman trying to regain command of a collapsing world. He told her plainly that he could no longer survive being pulled between two women who owned him, who demanded emotional choices from someone who had no right to choose anything at all. His words cracked something in Caroline's armor. She recognized truth in them, but instead of offering mercy, she reached for control. She announced she would sell him to Mobile, have him processed and shipped far away, severing the conflict permanently. Catherine overheard and burst into the room, demanding the sale be stopped. When Caroline refused, Catherine made a desperate offer to divide the entire Yansy estate so she could keep Samuel and free him. Her voice shook with conviction, but Caroline dismissed her as delusional, reminding her that such a confession in court would lead to Samuel's execution and Catherine's ruin. In that suffocating room with Rose and Isaac standing in terrified silence, Samuel made his own declaration. He said he would choose Catherine if choice truly mattered, but also admitted that in a world built on chains, his preference meant nothing. And with that truth spoken aloud, the last fragile thread holding the Yansy sisters together finally snapped. As dusk fell on May 22nd, the Yansy plantation felt unnervingly still, as if the land itself sensed the storm waiting to break open. Catherine, driven by desperation rather than reason, crafted a reckless escape plan, writing Samuel a note instructing him to meet her at midnight in the garden house and prepare to flee north under cover of darkness. She imagined herself a tragic heroine, ready to abandon wealth, reputation, and safety in exchange for love and redemption. But the plan was a fantasy, impossible under the brutal machinery of the slave system, a system Samuel understood far more deeply than she ever could. While Catherine packed money and supplies, convinced she could outrun an entire county, Samuel sat in his quarters weighing a choice between two certain dooms, being sold away or dying during an attempted escape. Isaac warned him that escape meant dogs, bullets, and public execution, while staying meant Caroline's control tightening like a noose. Samuel knew there was no victory left in this story, only the smallest chance at choosing how he would fall. Meanwhile, Rose, terrified by the rising tension, terrified for her children, terrified of what happened when white families spiraled out of control, made a decision she believed would protect her own. She slipped into Overseer Virgil Henley's cottage and revealed everything she had overheard: the sisters' rivalry, the secret meetings, the midnight escape plan Catherine intended to launch. Henley, who already resented the twins' leadership and loathed educated enslaved men, felt vindicated and furious all at once. To him, Samuel wasn't a man caught in an impossible trap. He was a threat to order, a spark that could ignite rebellion, a problem that required swift and brutal resolution. He gathered 6 overseers from nearby plantations, men who understood the unspoken rules of maintaining control on southern estates, and positioned them around the garden house before midnight, armed with pistols, rifles, and torches. Their intention was simple and deadly: intercept Samuel, destroy him, and restore the hierarchy they believed the Yansy sisters had weakened. At 11:45 p.m., Samuel stepped into the humid darkness, moving quietly past the sleeping mansion, unaware that armed men lurked among the oaks and outbuildings, their torches smoldering like watchful eyes. He felt the weight of inevitability pressing against his ribs, but still he walked toward the garden house, unwilling to abandon Catherine, unwilling to shatter the last fragile thread of hope she still clung to. When he pushed open the door, Catherine stood in the lantern glow, her face soft with relief when she saw him. She whispered that she feared he wouldn't come, and he replied that he did, but warned her again that this escape was impossible, that she was dreaming against the iron wall of reality. Before she could answer, the door slammed open as Henley and his men surged inside, weapons drawn, faces carved with purpose. The lantern light flickered wildly, freezing everyone in a moment of horrifying clarity. An enslaved man and a white woman caught together, surrounded by men eager to impose deadly punishment. Henley ordered Samuel to step away, twisting the truth into an accusation of assault, a lie that slavery's world accepted without question. Catherine tried to intervene, insisting she had invited Samuel, that no crime had occurred, but Henley cut her off with the cold authority of a man who believed he understood justice better than anyone. He told her to return to the house before she said something that would doom her reputation, her safety, or her life. But before the men could force Samuel outside, a new voice shattered the tension. Caroline, standing in the doorway in her nightrobe, having followed her intuition and the distant glimmer of torchlight. She took in the scene with a single sweep of her eyes, and Catherine, wild with grief, begged her sister to speak the truth. Caroline hesitated, standing at the crossroads between morality and the social order that had shaped her entire existence. Finally, she sided with Henley, confirming the false accusation and sealing Samuel's fate with a single sentence. At that moment, something inside Catherine broke so violently that everyone in the room could feel it. The moment Caroline sided with Henley, Samuel's fate became sealed in a way no one could undo. The overseers seized him, binding his hands while Catherine screamed and fought with a desperation that bordered on madness. Caroline ordered her sister dragged back to the house and locked in her room, her own voice trembling with a mixture of guilt, fear, and the cold obedience to the system she had chosen to protect. Henley and his men marched Samuel toward the old cotton gin house, where a massive oak tree loomed in the darkness, a tree that had witnessed many horrors in its lifetime, but none as tangled in jealousy and betrayal as this one. Caroline pleaded only for the death to be quick, but her words meant nothing now. Samuel walked without resisting, shoulders straight, carrying the quiet dignity he had always maintained even when the entire world pressed down on him like a vice. And sometime between midnight and 1 in the morning, under a sky so still it felt suffocated, Samuel's life was ended beneath the branches of that old tree. Catherine broke free shortly after, climbing out her window and landing hard enough to crack bone, but the pain didn't slow her. She dragged herself across the grounds, following lantern light and shadows until she reached the oak tree. There she found Samuel's body still swaying gently in the humid night air, and the sound that tore from her throat was something no human language could explain. She cut him down with a shaking hand, pulling him into her lap, cradling him as if holding him tightly could drag life back into his chest. Caroline arrived moments later, breathless and horrified, watching her sister rock back and forth in the dirt, covered in blood and sobbing as though her lungs might burst. For a brief, fragile instant, both sisters seemed to understand the enormity of what they had done, not just to Samuel, but to themselves, to the entire plantation, to the very world they believed they controlled. And in that dreadful silence, the first sparks of rebellion began to take shape behind them. The enslaved quarters had awakened to the screams, and dozens emerged into the night, drawn toward the oak tree by grief, fury, and shock. They saw Samuel's lifeless body, saw Miss Catherine clutching him, saw Miss Caroline standing pale and hollow, and saw Henley's armed men nearby, the ones responsible for the murder. Old Dina, Samuel's friend, and the woman who had tried to warn him, stepped forward and spoke words that rippled through the crowd like fire through dry grass. She declared that Samuel had been killed over jealousy, over 2 white women fighting over a black man they believed they owned, and that this truth needed to be seen for exactly what it was. Henley tried to force everyone back to their quarters, raising his hand to strike Dina, but the old woman didn't move. Instead, Isaac lifted a shovel, Silas lifted a piece of firewood, and as more enslaved workers armed themselves with whatever they could reach, the fragile illusion of control that held plantation life together finally collapsed. What followed was not a battle in any formal sense. It was a frantic, violent eruption of years of suppressed humanity crashing into the brutality of a system built on suffering. Gunshots split the night, torches fell, fists swung, tools became weapons, and bodies, black and white, hit the ground. Henley's men fought ruthlessly, but they were outnumbered, overwhelmed by the fury of people who had been forced to bow their heads for their entire lives. Catherine, still drenched in blood and grief, grabbed her pistol and fired into the chaos, striking down the very men who had murdered the man she loved. A bullet found her moments later, dropping her beside Samuel. Caroline rushed forward, trying to stop the violence, but she was caught in the crossfire and fell only a few feet away from her sister. In mere minutes, 17 people lay dead. The Yansy twins, Henley, 4 of his men, Samuel, and 9 enslaved workers who had either fought or simply been pulled into the storm. By sunrise, fire consumed the plantation. Whether set deliberately or sparked by fallen torches, the flames devoured the mansion, the gin house, and generations of wealth that had been built on stolen labor. When the sheriff arrived with reinforcements, they constructed a convenient lie, claiming Samuel had assaulted Catherine, that Henley had intervened heroically, and that the enslaved workers had launched an unprovoked rebellion. The love triangle, the jealousy, the desperation, the truth, none of it appeared in the official report. The surviving enslaved people were sold in distant markets, scattered across the Deep South, torn from one another to erase any shared memory of resistance. The magistrate sealed the testimonies for 73 years, hiding the true cause of the violence behind thick legal walls. When the files were finally unsealed in 1925, historians recoiled at the contents, realizing that the tragedy had not been born from rebellion, but from the twisted intersection of power, ownership, love, and jealousy. The oak tree survived the fire and stood for 60 more years, a silent witness to everything buried under layers of fear and denial. It finally fell in a storm in 1912, long after the Yansy name had faded, and only whispers remained in Dallas County. Generations passed down fragments of the tale, some blaming the twins, some blaming Samuel, others blaming the collapse of the plantation order itself. Yet the real lesson lay deeper. That love cannot exist where ownership rules, that power distorts every human emotion, and that slavery poisoned not only those it enslaved, but also those who believed themselves its masters. The tragedy of May 23, 1852, wasn't just a bloody night on an Alabama plantation. It was the inevitable result of a system that demanded control over other human beings, even their hearts. And in the end, 17 lives were extinguished because 2 sisters refused to accept a truth the world still struggles to face. You can chain a body, but you can never rightfully claim a person's soul.